Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Don Miller. Don Miller represents the 121st Assembly District. That is a part of New York State that includes the suburbs of the city of Syracuse in Onondaga County. We want to thank you folks in Onondaga County for joining us. And Don Miller, it is nice to see you.
It's always good to be here. Thank you.
Well, I think in our last program we talked about the passage of the state budget, and it was on time, and the impact of the budget on the people you represent. And there was part of that conversation, though, that was left unfinished, I'll say, and that was in the budget that was passed by the legislature and that the governor has since signed into law, there was something missing. Something, and that's not an editorial opinion on my part, but there was a particular issue that was debated quite often that was expected by many to be in that budget, and it wasn't, and that was property tax cap, a way to put a limit on year-to-year cost increases in local property taxes. It was expected, as I said, by many to be part of this year's negotiated budget. Certainly the governor talked about it a lot. Legislative leaders talked about it.
They did.
But the budget came and went. No property tax cap.
The budget came and went very, very quickly. There were a number of things that should have been in there that weren't. The governor and the legislature have taken credit for an on-time budget and for a budget that, cuts spending and does it without new taxes and all of these things. But what they can't talk about are the things that folks who pay taxes and raise kids and work jobs are really interested in. They can't talk about any tax cuts. They can't talk about any spending reductions. They can't speak in any fashion about actually reining in and controlling the size, the scope of government. The tax cap is one of those. I've got a bill in the legislature to cap property taxes at 0%, and in the very same bill, eliminate unfunded state mandates on local governments and school districts. There's absolutely no mention of that during the budget process. There was a little bit of a political game played with rent control and property tax cap, but the property tax cap that was discussed was a 2% property tax cap, which in my opinion is just a tax increase. It did not include any relief for unfunded mandates, and really it was used as a political hammer to kind of squirt the rent control bill out of the process.
We heard during that budget debate from the governor that he supports a property tax cap, and he wanted that included in the budget. We even heard from the legislative leaders. Of course, the Senate's already passed a property tax cap legislation that would put a 2% cap on year-to-year increases. And we even heard from the Assembly Speaker that he supports it. Or is that what, I think it was the governor who coined the phrase recently, Albany speak, where that's just people talking about something without maybe not much interest in actually getting it done?
Well, listen, it's all Albany speak at this point. Whether it's the governor's 2% property tax cap proposal, a 2% cap is not a cap. A 2% cap is virtually a guaranteed automatic tax increase every year. In a tax cap environment, in an environment where local governments have to live under a tax cap, if that tax cap is above 0, then those locals will increase taxes to the maximum, whether it's 2 or 4 or like they've done in Queens County, 10%. They're going to go the cap every year, believing that there may be some year in the future when they want to go more than 2 or more than 4, but they're unable to because of the cap. And so they'll work to build up a reserve. And so a 2% or 3% or 4% cap is a guaranteed tax increase. The governor's proposal and the proposal that was passed in the Senate as well, I believe, also doesn't address unfunded mandates. Whether your cap is 0 or 2 or 4 or 10, if that cap is not accompanied by relief for local governments, school districts, from unfunded state mandates, then that cap is a disaster for the locals. Local governments, including school districts, will go bankrupt somewhere between 18 and 36 months after you impose a cap if there's no relief for them from unfunded state mandates.
Well, I'm a little curious about your proposal for a 0% tax increase. If you were to get that implemented, and that would say to municipalities and school districts, you cannot increase your property tax revenue, your way you collect revenues through the property tax. I mean, costs go up year to year. There's inflation. There's always cost of living increases all across the board.
Sure. But
how would you get away without having the ability to raise more via the property tax?
well, here's the thing. Not increasing a tax, keeping a tax flat at zero growth is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. If you ask anybody who pays taxes, they're going to tell you that taxes that don't go up are better than taxes that do go up.
I'm with you on that point.
Okay? Here's how it works. If you impose a 0% tax cap, which is my proposal, with relief for local governments from unfunded state mandates, and that's an awful lot of Albany speak for, when the state tells a school district you have to hire X number of people, or you have to implement this program, or that you have to comply with these regulations, but the state doesn't provide any money for the school district to do those things. The school district is then forced to spend money. The state mandates a certain amount of spending by the school district. The school district doesn't have anywhere to go except to local homeowners to raise the money to pay for those things. If you deny Albany the opportunity, if you deny them the ability to drive costs, to drive spending at the local level, then a property tax cap makes perfect sense. You can do it. And in fact, what happens is this. What my bill says is that we implement a 0% property tax cap. Year on year, 0% growth in property taxes. At the same time, you relieve these unfunded state mandates. You don't require local government school districts to spend money on state programs. Albany has to take care of that spending. Mm-hmm. This does a couple of things. First of all, it exposes Albany's true addiction to spending. We actually get a clear picture of how much of our money Albany is spending every year, because suddenly we're counting it all. Albany now has to budget for it. They have to pay for these things. Or they can find ways to trim these mandates that they've placed on locals, or they can find ways to eliminate them. And that's the key. Just because a tax exists doesn't mean that it ought to increase over time. There's an assumption, a 2% property tax cap or a 4% cap rests on the assumption that government is entitled to a natural rate of growth. And that's an assumption that normal, average working folks don't make when they open their paycheck every week. We can't simply assume that I, Don Miller, Joe Working Family, am entitled to a natural rate of growth. I can't go to my employer and say, hey, by the way, I didn't get my natural rate of growth increase this week. Government does that to us, though. The presumption that 2% is necessary because things grow is, to me, a faulty assumption, because the people who are supporting government can't make that assumption about their own paychecks.
And look at me. I fell right into your trap. That was the very assumption that I made when I set that up. Let's look at this year's situation now, based on the passage of that state budget here a couple of weeks ago in Albany. This is a budget that saw reductions in state aid to school districts. So now we have the clear opportunity to see what the reaction to that is on the part of the various school districts across the state. Let me ask you what you're seeing as they've seen their aid from Albany go down. Mm-hmm. How are they responding with their budget proposals that will be voted on very shortly all across the state? People are going to be going to vote on their school budgets. Are they coming up with some big property tax increases?
Interestingly, no. And this is actually one of the meaty questions that I typically get on a 0% property tax cap. How are schools going to survive? When you relieve school districts, local governments, of that state-mandated, that mandated state spending, when you shift that spending to Albany, there's still a revenue stream that exists on the local level. And suddenly that revenue stream is unspoken for. There are no programs there for it to fund. What my bill says is that those unneeded revenues, that revenue stream that's unspoken for, 75% of that revenue stream gets turned back to the taxpayers. 25% of that remains with the local taxing authority, whether it's a school district or a town or a village or a county. 25% remains there so that they can actually regain control of their budget process. They can handle things like the increasing cost of gasoline and salt, or contracts, or increasing insurance for emergency vehicles. They can take care of those things at a much more reasonable level from the perspective of the local taxpayer. And that's why a 0% property tax cap with mandate relief in the same bill, that's why it works. It's because it pushes Albany to admit how much it spends, and it relieves local taxpayers from the burden that Albany is sort of hiding from them at the moment.
It almost creates, it almost creates a zero-based budgeting situation for the school districts. They really then are given the opportunity to say, all right, what are we about? What programs do we want to offer in our schools to the children? Instead of having the state say, you must now have pre-kindergarten, the local school board members can decide, do we want to do that? If we do, all right. If we don't, all right. And then, hey, guess what? We'll be accountable to the voters when we run for re-election, right?
That's exactly right. What this does is it returns real control, probably for the first time in more than a generation. It returns real control in local budgeting to local governments and school districts, so that voters, when they go and they vote on their school budget, they're actually making choices. Right now, the way it works, 96% of that school budget is predetermined by mandates that the state imposes on local governments. So when voters go to the polls and vote on a school budget, they really aren't choosing a school budget. What they're doing is they're ratifying what the state has required of them.
How many times have we heard those stories, again, especially in upstate districts where voters have gone to the polls and rejected a school budget, only to have the school board members say, oh, I guess we're going to have to put an austerity budget before the voters, and then come to find out it's maybe a fraction of 1% smaller than the original budget proposal they put out there.
Or sometimes higher. Sometimes those austerity budgets, those contingency budgets, sometimes they're actually higher than the supposedly voluntary budget that voters turned down. This is one of the key elements of this. Returning that local control means that homeowners, business owners, they get to make decisions about their own financial future. New York State we are worst in the nation on job creation because we tax and we regulate and we spend more than anyone else in the country. Those are the types of things that need to change if we're going to secure jobs and create opportunity for our kids.
We saw the voters in the November 2010 elections respond to a message and change. We've got a new governor in the state. We've got a lot of new members of the legislature. Things in this budget debate this year, there were different debates than we'd heard in many years here. Do you think this message about what's going on, the relationship the state has with school districts, with its municipalities, do you think the voters now, the public, is starting to understand that a little bit more?
I think they're starting to understand. This is going to be a long road. This is going to be a tough fight. I held a series of meetings with the mayors, town supervisors, school district officials in my district, in my assembly district, over a number of weeks. We ended up doing a press conference together in support of the 0% property tax cap with the mandate relief. All of the elected officials in my district, because once folks really understand that not only can this work, but it will work if it's tried, support just sort of blossoms. It sort of comes from places you don't really expect. But the message is so different. It's so, I don't want to say
you're reinventing
unusual.
the wheel. You really are.
Well, it's kind of it's a bit of a paradigm shift for Albany. Albany sort of believes that, again, it's entitled to a natural rate of growth, and that taxpayers really owe Albany, a certain portion of their paycheck. And I simply disagree with that. I don't think that government naturally has a right to grow. I think that government is something that needs to be lean and efficient. It's a tool that we can use to help people who need help. But I don't think that it's something that ought to be sort of out there living a life on its own without controls from taxpayers, from moms and dads.
Well, we're out of time. There's some definite truth in what you said, though, because there was a decrease in state revenues the last few years, but we have still seen increases in spending in the state's budgeting the last few years. Don Miller, we will revisit this with you in an upcoming program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We want to thank you folks, too, for spending your time with us. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.